Hi, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us while we just let a few more people join us. Danielle and we've delivered this Resi webinar a few times now on kind of the planning system, how to navigate it, and we're really thrilled with the engagement we've had on it so far. So we're stoked to kind of do it again and have a chance to take you through what we're going to take you through, which is the planning system, how to navigate it, and how to kind of maximize your chances of success as well. My name is Joe. In a kind of former life, I trained as a town planner in New Zealand and then returned to the UK 8 years ago. I've worked for a number of local planning authorities in London in town planning departments, and now I'm Resi's head of operations. I oversee a number of our teams, and one of those is our fantastic planning team, of which Danielle is a part.
Hi, I'm Danielle. I'm one of the senior planners here at Resi, and I've had a lot of experience working in local authority. And then I've been at Resi for around 3 years now. And Joe and I are really looking forward to today's session. And our aim really is to try and simplify the planning process for you all, give you all a guide on the most important things that you need to know to navigate it. And between Joe and I'm sure we can get to the bottom of any confusion that you may have for a planning journey.
100%. So now you know a little bit about Danielle and I, but what about Resi kind of more generally? Well, for homeowners, we're actually the #1 home extension company in the UK. Why is that the case? Well, ultimately, we do more projects than anyone else, and we've therefore got more familiarity with your neighborhood, with your local planning authorities, and the types of projects that you guys are doing. We take on around 120 new projects a month, which is kind of 10 times more than your typical architect. And since we started, we've actually recently hit the 7,000 plus project mark, which is a massive number. And that volume doesn't mean we kind of do things slowly either. We're very kind of efficient in the way we get you through your home improvement journey. So from the time you kind of start your process with us, we can get you to the planning process, which we'll talk about today, in around 30 days.
Thanks, Joan. So before we properly crack on, I wanted to take a moment to explain why we are the expert in the fields of like householder applications and projects. Firstly, Joe and myself and the rest of the planning consultants here do have experience working for local authorities. So we really understand the pressures that case officers face and sort of the key issues that they're concerned about. And this is quite unique. A lot of architectural practices don't sort of have those in-house planning teams. And additionally, as Joe said, we have more experience than any other practice dealing with the planning system. In those 7,000 plus projects we have around 8,600 plus actual applications across England. And we do it really well. We have a success rate of around 96%. And this gives us a real greater familiarity with a large number of councils. We've submitted to more than 130 of them across the country. So we've got plenty of experience with sort of getting projects through that planning system in England. And then just a quick note before I hand back over to Joe, if you do have any questions, we've got a Q&A box that you can put them in and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end.
Thank you. So before we kind of dive into the specifics of the planning journey for homeowners, I actually wanted to start by unpacking a little bit around what we actually mean by planning. We know that planning can be one of the kind of most mysterious parts of the home improvement journey to a lot of people. And because of the number of projects we've done, we're really well versed in explaining what it is, why it's important, and kind of what the process might look like for everyday homeowners. And so I'm going to start with that. I want to start first and foremost by outlining kind of why it's important, because we know that it can be a bit of a pain point. It can seem overly slow at times. The things that planning officers are interested in can often seem really trivial to a lot of people, but it's a hugely important system. And there are two critical things, particularly for homeowners, which make it a really important system. The first is that it helps ensure that our kind of built environment, so our homes, all the buildings that are in our environment, are nice. They look similar, they have a similar aesthetic, and that's really important for protecting that built environment. The second one is that it helps to ensure that new development, so extensions that your neighbours are putting up, for example, keep our existing homes nice to live in. It kind of makes sure that that Danielle, if she's my neighbour, isn't going to put up a massive roof terrace that overlooks me when I'm having a barbecue in the summer, or a massive extension that blocks all my light out, right? And I think that's one of the really important protections that it puts in place. And later on, Danielle's going to kind of take us through a bit more detail how we can account for those two critical factors when we're designing extensions for you guys. And therefore, kind of while the planning process can be a bit painful, it's really important in protecting those things. And it's administered at two levels, the national and the local. At the national level, you have this national policy and guidance. And really what that does is set out what your local council's policy and guidance should look like. And then we have this system of permitted development, which a lot of you might have heard of before. And it sets out at a national level how that's applied, what it includes, what it doesn't include. Then at the local level, you have local policies, and those typically, as you would expect, reflect local issues that are important to local people, and they're developed through consulting with residents. And then you have local guidance and local design guidance, which puts the meat on the bones. It essentially tells you how you're meant to comply with those policies. And together, those national and local controls, they're administered through something that most people will be familiar with, which is the planning application process. And the planning application process broadly falls into two categories when it comes to homeowners, PD applications and householder applications and full applications. If you can't or you're not using permitted development, the two light purple categories on the right, that is householder, which is about 75% of the work we do at Resi, and the full application are the kind of application processes you're likely to engage with. And the full application is used when you're a flat because you don't have permitted development rights, or where you're crossing boundaries, for example, if you're undertaking works in conjunction with a neighbour. Then those on the left, the dark purple categories, those are the two application types which really relate to those nationally set permitted development controls. And we're really experienced in this area, and Danielle particularly is really knowledgeable in the area of permitted development. And so fortunately for us, she's going to kind of take us through that system and how to use it when designing home extensions.
Thanks, Joe. That was quite helpful. So, permitted development, I'm sure you've heard of it, but what exactly is it and how does it work? Well, in a nutshell, permitted development, or PD as it's more commonly known, allows homeowners to improve or extend their homes without applying for formal planning permission. Permitted development is set out at a national level and in theory should be applied consistently by all councils, although there is a little bit of sway here and there. And while you don't need to apply for formal planning permission, if you want confirmation that your project does fall under PD, you can apply for what's known as a Lawful Development Certificate, or LDC, as Joe's just mentioned. So why is permitted development important and how can it help you? Well, it provides certainty to homeowners on common projects, and it can really help simplify and hopefully speed up your planning journey. Additionally, one of the key benefits of an LDC is that it doesn't involve consultation with your neighbours. So if they don't like it, it's kind of tough luck. But here at Resi, we do consider ourselves experts when it comes to PD. We have an approval rate of around 98% on these types of applications. I know, why not 100%? I'm sure you're asking, but that's because, like most things in life, PD isn't actually always black and white, and sometimes some issues can arise. But in the rare event that it does occur, we are able to guide you through this and ensure that the project gets back on track. So, we've covered why it's important, but what can you actually do? And well, that's quite a bit, really. Some of the most common projects that we do under PD at Resi include ground floor side or rear extensions, loft conversions, which includes hipped gables, dormers, outriggers, new outbuildings for all those like home offices or gyms, things like that. And then other improvement projects like new boundary walls or installations of new doors, windows, roof lights. And some of the photos that you can see there are some of the projects that we've done under PD. And then some more less common projects under permitted development, subject to the relevant conditions being met, are two-storey rear extensions. These can be quite picky, so it really does depend on your property type, whether that one's applicable to you. And then other more green interventions, such as solar panels or air source heat pumps. So what if you wanted to build an extension that's typically larger than what can be done under PD? There's actually an avenue for this, and it's quite appropriately named a larger home extension scheme, which allows you to apply for extensions up to 8 metres in depth on a detached house or up to 6 metres in depth for either semi-detached, terraces, just any other property type, and they're all just off the rear. So whilst the scheme does fall under that umbrella of permitted development, the applications for these larger rear extensions require what is known as prior approval from the council. And then to put this simply, this means that the council will send letters to your adjoining neighbours informing them of the proposed application, which they don't do on the other LDC applications. If any of your neighbours object to the scheme, the council do unfortunately have the power to refuse this application if they think it would unacceptably impact your neighbour. So there's a few things to keep in mind when you're doing a PD project. I personally think that the most important one is to check if your PD rights have been removed. As Joe noted previously, if you're in a flat, you don't have PD rights, but it's also more common for these to be removed from new builds, or if your property is in a conservation area. If your PD rights have been removed, it's not the end of the world. You can just apply for a householder or a full application. That's absolutely fine. Secondly is, has your property been previously extended? This can make applying under PD a bit more difficult. Again, there's no need to worry. You can just go down another application route. The third thing, and I can't stress this enough if you're doing a larger home extension, is to consult with your neighbours beforehand. Show them your plans, tell them what you're doing. If your neighbour objects to that larger home extension, the council, like I said, have the ability to refuse it. And then lastly is, if your house type is quite unique, given the variation in design of individual houses, extensions to unusual property types cannot always be done under PD. As with the above examples, not an issue. You just simply have to look into submitting your application through a householder application. So hopefully that was quite a useful summary of permitted development and how you can use it to simplify your planning journey. But now we're going to go over to Joe, who's going to do a deep dive into what happens during the actual planning application process.
Thank you, Danielle. So we've looked at kind of the application types, and Danielle's given a really good overview of what permitted development is, how we can use it. But kind of once you've weighed up all of your options and you're going to embark on your planning journey, I want to look at what actually happens in and around that process so that everyone is kind of clued up and understands the kind of steps that you're likely to go through. And first off, I'm actually going to talk about what happens just before you start that planning journey. At this stage of the planning process, it is all about understanding what you have to work with. You know, what precedent is there on the street? What design guidelines and local policies do you need to work with? What risks do you have in your project? Do you have those permitted development rights that Danielle spoke about? And so working with your designer and your planner is really, really important at this stage of the process because they can take on the bulk of the work. Kind of help you to understand what the key issues are and the risks are that I spoke about. And it helps you to make an informed decision around the kind of proposals that you want to take forward. It might include getting a little bit of pre-application advice from the council as well. And then ideally you build this full picture in your head of all the policies, the risks and the rewards that are on the cards. And your planner and your designer help you come up with a scheme based on those risks. And once you've weighed all that up, you can kind of prepare with your designer and with your planner all of the technical documents that you need to submit to your local council. And that's going to include all of your drawn plans and all of your kind of architectural details, etc., as well as any technical documents that you might need based on the specifics of your property or your project. And then once you've kind of got all that done, the plunge will be taken and you'll be thrown into the kind of application process with your local council. And the first step you're going to go through with your local council is one called validation. Put simply, this is essentially just where your local council checks through all those documents that I just spoke about to make sure that they've got everything they need to make a decision, to understand what you've put forward, and that they can check it against those permitted development limits or those local policies and guidelines that we spoke about. And once that's been done, you're going to get a planning officer who is responsible for assessing your application, like Danielle and I used to be. And the first thing that your officer is going to do is start that period of consultation, if relevant, as Danielle alluded to before, where your neighbours get a chance to comment on the proposals. And kind of in and around that process, your planning officer is going to undertake the big piece of work, the kind of meaty bit of the planning application process, which is assessing the proposal against policies, against guidance, and against those permitted development limits that we've alluded to before. And the important thing to kind of bear in mind here is that depending on how ambitious your project is, it's really not uncommon to have your planning officer reach out and ask for clarifications or sometimes even changes to make your proposals comply with those policies, with those guidance. And while all that is going on, you'll have a planning agent, usually, hopefully, and someone like Resi. And what we do is we essentially manage all of that communication with your planning officer. We try to reach out very early on in the process because in our experience, it helps kind of push things along towards a positive outcome and get there quicker, hopefully. Engaging with planners early on is super important because it shows a willingness to kind of work with them, that understand the key issues that they're facing, and getting things turned around quickly and towards a positive outcome is obviously always advisable. In terms of the timing of this formal process, the actual targets that most councils have for applications is 8 weeks from the point that it's made valid. But what we say is that because of the kind of issues that you can sometimes experience or delays in council processing, we allow up to 12 weeks for people to get through that process so that you're not kind of waiting around and disappointed when things don't come in bang on 8 weeks. And then hopefully, once you've been through that kind of part of the process, and fortunately for Resi, in the vast majority of instances, as Danielle has alluded to, you get through an approval from your local authority. And once you've got your approval in hand, in my view, you can kind of relax a little bit because for me, you've passed through what can be one of the most frustrating parts of the process of home improvement. And the reason I think for that is because you have to kind of give over control of the timings of the course of your project to the council. And while you kind of have an agent to steer things and keep it on track, ultimately you do lose physical control of the process for a little bit. And once you've kind of got that approval, the relief you feel and the kind of achievement that you feel in getting that is massive. Certainly is for us when we get those approvals through. And the good news is that once you have that approval in hand, it lasts for 3 years before you need to act on it. Why that's important is it means that there's no rush to kind of crack on and get building straight away. And obviously, you're going to want to keep momentum up on your project. Obviously, you are. But the good thing is that having that in hand means that you can kind of take stock, you can start to understand the next steps without needing to rush to build. And it allows the flexibility to pursue projects at your own speed. The last thing really to say about that approval notice is that you should always check it for things called conditions. And what conditions are essentially a prerequisite to starting your work. And the council will often put conditions on to ask you to submit more information or clarification when you get further along in the build process. So it's always important to check your decision notice for those. If they're on there, then that's totally fine. We can support with making sure those conditions are fulfilled prior to getting on site. And so that's roughly it. That's how the application process should unfold, all going well. And Danielle's going to take you through now all of the kind of key issues that we think arise typically during that process that are worth bearing in mind.
Yes, thank you. So if you are looking to submit your project under a householder or a full planning, what are some of the planning issues that your council will consider? There's two key ones, and that are pretty much always considered by your case officer during the application assessment. The first one would be design, and then the second one would be the impact on your neighbours. And we'll go into those in a bit more detail shortly. But are there any other issues? Well, yes, there definitely can be. It is really important to establish early on in the planning process if there are any other constraints. And, you know, this can be flood risks or a conservation area. And these additional restrictions or designations that are applied by the council can cause issues further down the line. So when we're talking about design, this can encompass a number of different factors relating to a project or extension. The first one being how visible it is, its size, and in particular whether it would dominate the host building, and whether the aesthetic, including materials, would be sympathetic to the host building. Now, where design is of particular importance is when an extension is visible from the street scene or could have an impact on it. And this includes side extensions, front extensions, even small porches. And then moving on to heritage. This is of increased importance when your property is listed or in a conservation area, because then there's a real need for the design to respect that heritage asset. And the councils have a dedicated conservation team who will assess the impacts of your project from a heritage perspective. A quick fact is that every local authority in England has at least one conservation area, and there's around 10,000 of them across the country. So if you're not sure if your property is listed or in one of these conservation areas, you can book in with us for one of our free advice calls, and then we can help you find out whether that information is relevant to you. So moving on to the issue of neighbouring impact, this encompasses like all the different ways that your project could impact your neighbour. In our experience, the key impacts that a case officer will look for are the size and position of the extension, and would this result in a loss of light to your neighbours? Would it overshadow their garden or any downstairs or even upstairs windows? Would the size of your extension appear overbearing to your neighbour? This is a particular concern when a large extension would extend up to the boundary of the neighbouring property. Or are there any new windows or sight lines, like Joe mentioned before, terraces, that could potentially overlook your neighbour and lead to a loss of privacy? I do think it is important to note that if your neighbour submits an objection to the application on amenity grounds, the planning officer may scrutinise this neighbour impact in a bit more detail. From our experience, neighbouring impacts are the most likely issue to result in an application being refused, unfortunately, or the council potentially requesting amendments. So again, it's really, really important to speak to your neighbour. So then, this is a bit of a catch-all, but are there any technical issues that could influence your application's decision? Sort of a summary of the ones that we frequently encounter. Flood risk. This is really important to identify early on in the process, because it's likely that if you are in a flood risk zone, then a flood risk assessment will have to accompany your application. Secondly is trees. Are there any trees on your site which are protected? All mature trees in conservation areas are protected, and if you have this close to your site or within it, you may be required to do a tree survey by the council. Thirdly is the effects on like wildlife or nature conservation. The most common one that we experience is bats, particularly in more rural areas. If it is within one of these areas that is considered suitable for bat roosting, they may require a preliminary roost assessment. Also, Greenbelt councils put a lot of restrictions on how much you can extend in a greenbelt, so that is something to keep in mind. That's a summary. I wouldn't say that's an exhaustive list. There's a number of other things or restrictions that your specific council could put on your area, so it is important to look into these before doing an application. Back over to Joe.
Thank you, Danielle. Yeah, I mean, it must be kind of worrying that Danielle lists about 40 different things and then says it's not an exhaustive list. So I'm going to try and lighten that message by setting out not just the problems as we've just done, but the kind of headline tips to simplify your planning success and simplify your entire planning journey. The first of my tips, and this is very kind of self-congratulatory, and I would say it obviously, but is to use a consultant. And I genuinely believe it makes a huge, huge difference. You know, while I don't think it should be this way, but it is, the planning system can be incredibly confusing. You know, not only do you have to worry about your neighbors, but now Danielle tells you you have to worry about bats as well. And it can be really frustrating unless you're experienced with the nuts and bolts of that. And so having people on your team who have experience in applying that policy, but particularly in working for councils as well as submitting applications to councils, it takes the stress out of the process. It helps avoid those unexpected bumps. You know, we keep on top of your case officer, we keep on top of the issues that are arising, and we do all the general admin of getting things in order to submit during the process and afterwards, which can be quite tedious if you're not familiar with the nuts and bolts, as I say. And so having a consultant, it's really, really important for that, you know, whether it's us or not. That's my biggest tip to you. The second piece of advice is to be realistic. And what I mean by that is to listen to the advice of your designer and your planner at that front end, like I kind of set out. You know, as a planner on our team, Danielle's not there to try and take the enjoyment out of your home improvement journey or take the creativity out of your extension design. What the purpose of a planner on our team is to try and allow that creativity to lead to something that your builder can crack on and deliver on site, right? Rather than something that never makes it off the drawings that your architect prepares.
Definitely.
And so understanding the kind of planning advice and the design advice that your planner and your designer give you up front and adjusting your expectations based on that advice and those risks, it's super critical to maximize your chances of getting through the planning process with a successful outcome, but also that getting there isn't completely painful as well. Similar to that, actually, is understanding what your priorities are. Say Danielle and I were both going through a home improvement journey separately. If Danielle's priority was speed and budget, she might want to fully kind of minimize the risk of any bumps in the road. It might mean that she's a bit more conservative in the project she puts forward to planning. It might mean that she uses her PD rights rather than pushing the boat out with a householder application. Whereas, say, I'm going through the process and all I care about is maximizing the space that I get, then I probably need to make sure that budget and time aren't something that I'm worried about. That having an ambitious planning application that might take a little bit longer is fine. When I weigh that up in the balance. And so you need to decide, you know, where on the spectrum of Danielle to Joe are you really? And as part of your priorities as well, it's also really important to understand what your bottom lines are. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned before that it's not uncommon for planners to ask for changes during the application process. And so it's important that when you enter that application process, you know what you're willing to compromise on if a planner asks you to do so. Are you willing to change your materials, the pitch of your roof, the depth of your extension? You know, all of those things are things that you should be bearing in mind, and your designer and your planner should be bearing in mind at the front end of the process. The last one, and we're going to sound like a broken record for saying this, but it genuinely is engaging and speaking with your neighbors as early on in the process as possible. You know, speaking to them well before your project starts, well before the council puts a letter through their postbox saying that you're doing a project is super key, particularly if you're going through that larger home extension process that Danielle explained to everyone before. Getting your neighbours on side, it avoids those objections that Danielle alluded to. They bring massive delay and complication to your project. Take our word for it. And so avoiding those is super important. And so speaking to your neighbour up front, massively important in getting around that blocker. It also helps in other ways, in that you can kind of get through any technical issues like party wall agreements a bit earlier in the process as well. So those are the four big tips that, if you were to take away nothing else from this session, those are the kind of four big things I think people should bear in mind. I'm going to pass back to Danielle in a second to kind of wrap us up. But before I do that, just a reminder, if you've got any questions, now's the time to start popping them in the Q&A box, because we'll kind of have about 25 minutes to get through them in a few moments' time.
Thank you. So I know we've covered a lot today, so I will just do a quick summary of what we've been over. Firstly, Joe provided an overview of the English planning system and hopefully anchored its importance. And then we looked at PD and why it can be used in your planning journey, how it can streamline everything and make that a little bit easier for yourself. After this, Joe took us through the key stages of the planning process, what happens before, during, after your application's been submitted. And then I ran through the key planning issues that can influence an applicant's outcome. And then finally, Joe very, very helpfully provided those 4 key tips to simplify your planning journey and hopefully make the process as stress-free as possible. So we'll go to the Q&A now, and we'll have a little look what people have got for us.
Bear with us while we have a look through these questions, and we'll get to them any second. So the first question is from Shital. And the question is, do either me or Danielle have any experience of doing extensions in Barnet? And the reason for that question is that they're thinking of doing an extension. They've got a huge garden and they want to push the kind of boundaries on the depth of that extension. Do we know if that is true? Well, I and Danielle personally have not worked in the London Borough of Barnet, but what I can say is that at Resi, we have done plenty of applications in Barnet. And so while I can't say right now whether or not a 5-metre extension or pushing the boundaries is acceptable, for a number of reasons, because we don't know the circumstances of your site and we'd need to look at that, but also we don't know policies off by heart, which is on us. And so the thing I would recommend you do is that you book in for an advice call with us. It's completely free. And our consultants, they're able to kind of look up in advance what your address is, what the policies are, what the decisions that we've had in your local area are. And those are the really important things to weigh up, because the precedent that's been set by us or by other applicants is kind of what sets decision making for the future. So looking through that all ahead of an advice call is super, super important. And we'd be able to tell you with pretty decent certainty what the likely outcome would be of an application of the kind of type that you asked for, Sheetal, and also kind of guide you through what the risks would be, where we think you should kind of balance that out. So yeah, that would be my biggest advice, is definitely get in touch, because we can do that research for free and kind of give you a steer ahead of time. Anything else to add on that one?
No, that sounds about right.
So we've got another question here, which is, what application is required if you live in a conservation area, a semi-detached property, and your neighbour is under shared ownership?
So that would depend kind of what entails that shared ownership and whether your property is classed as a dwelling house. If it is classed as a dwelling house and it's just a semi-detached and you both have interest, you can still use a householder application. What typically happens is you have to sign a certificate on the application stating that it is of shared ownership and naming that neighbour. That just lets the council know that there's somebody else with interest in the property. If it's not classed as a dwelling house, you'd have to use a full application. Again, this is something that we would look at in more detail if we were to help you on a planning journey and we'd establish that. And it doesn't really matter if you get it wrong that first time. The council would just tell you that you've submitted the wrong application type. and you could submit the right one and just fill out a different form, and they'd point you in the right direction.
For sure. Um, Paul Bernard asks, is the process for a double-story rear extension more complex? Um, the likely answer is honestly yes. While it depends on the specifics of your site, and this, it will annoy you because I'll sound like a broken record on this point too, but so much of planning does depend on the specifics of your site. So if I seem, or Danielle seems, kind of non-committal to give answers on specifics for any question today, that's why, is because it's all about your local policies that apply to your site. It's all about the specifics of your kind of terrace, of your housing typology, what's been built already. All of those things weigh in our minds when we're giving you advice about planning. And so, kind of any specifics, if you've got any doubt at all, then definitely book in with us for an advice call. It's super easy by visiting our website. But to the kind of double story rear extension point, Paul, like it's going to be more difficult, in all honesty, to get a double story rear extension through planning unless there is precedent for it in the locality. If your policies allow it, which most of the time in a kind of city they don't. But if you reach out to us and give us the kind of specifics of your site, we can really easily give you a kind of outline of the risks.
Yeah, I would say on that, as planners, we kind of have this golden phrase that is each application is assessed within its own merit. So even if a house 4 doors down from you has had a double story rear extension approved, it doesn't mean that the council will then approve yours. Like Joe said, it depends on the specifics of the site. So even local precedence doesn't really solidify a planning decision for you and sort of establish a complexity of a project.
Definitely. Noah's asked if they can see the recording afterwards. It's a very good question. Should have said it already. All of the webinars that we've done here at Resi, including this one, are available on our YouTube channel for you to see. So would recommend everyone goes over there and takes a look at those, because it's kind of the best place to see all of the things we've done. While I appreciate you all tuning in for the planning one, there might be another webinar that we've done that's also kind of relevant to you. So yeah, get over to YouTube and have a look afterwards. It'll be up there.
Yeah, so Anoop, we've said, what application types does annex fall under? Is building annex allowed for semi-detached properties? Now, this does depend how you want your annex. Do you want it in a separate outbuilding? Do you want it attached to the property? And again, it depends on if you've got your PD rights. And the sort of level that you want the annex. If you're happy to have a very small sized outbuilding in the rear of your garden, which just has a bedroom, maybe, and then just a toilet, then you could probably do that under permitted development. What takes that out of permitted development is if it could then end up being just a completely self-contained unit and it has a full bathroom, kitchenette, maybe multiple rooms within it. It is one of those grey areas of PD that I talked about before. A lot of the PD rules are quite binary in terms of like heights and measurements and things like that with outbuildings. There's a condition in there which is more open for interpretation, and that's for the actual use of the outbuilding. So again, get advice from a planner, really understand and establish what you want to achieve from the outbuilding or annex and exactly what you want in there. And then again, if you're unsure, like we said, you can apply for a lawful development certificate. If the council, for some reason, decide that it doesn't fall under PD, it doesn't mean that you can't have that annex. It just means that you then might have to apply for a householder.
We've got a question here which is really interesting that's asking, are there any proposed changes to permitted development rights? And actually there was recently a kind of big consultation about changing permitted development rights across England and Wales. And that consultation looked at kind of making them a bit more user-friendly and also making them more relaxed for householder extensions. And we advocated for that, and we have done at Resi to the government and to to all parties to try and simplify permitted development. As Danielle said,
Mm.
there's a reason it's not 100% for planning for permitted development, because there is nuance. There's some quite stringent limits you need to comply with. And in our view, like relaxing those, making them more focused to cater for extensions so you can make our existing housing stock more fit for purpose is massively important. Now, that consultation, who knows what's going to happen with that given yesterday's announcement. We would love to see changes to permit development be carried through
Yeah.
to the next government, but who knows what we'll face. But yes, there were proposed changes. Who knows what will happen to them next?
Mm. So we've got another question here, and I think this one is quite important. I said, how do we know if our council is experiencing delays in processing planning applications? Um, I don't think that this is something that you can particularly find out really just by Googling. They won't really be forthright with whether they're experiencing delays on their website or anything like that. It's something we know because we're submitting applications to councils every single day. We know when the timelines should be sort of met, and when they're not met, we actually update our internal database with this. So when we're advising you from the point of view coming to us with your very first interest, even to submitting the application and whilst it's live, we're constantly updating our internal database with each specific council's sort of timeline, so we can accurately give you that expectation on if you're going to be experiencing delays. Some councils have an out of office on their general inbox that will tell you if they're experiencing delays. Even some councils have gone to the point of being under special measures by the government, which you would see in the news. But in terms of if you can just Google it, that's not really a thing, unfortunately.
Another question is around the typical time frame from the start of the design process to receiving a planning approval. I kind of touched on this in two separate parts in the presentation. The first is that what we like to do at Resi is get you into design and get your planning prioritized as soon as possible. So I said at the front end, we try to take no more than 30 days from the point that you start your journey with us. You go through getting a survey, getting your existing house kind of built into a digital twin by our survey team. And then our talented team of designers will design your home extension onto that digital twin, prep everything that's required to get it into planning. And we try to do all of that in 30 days. From the point that you submit to a council, as I said, and it's quite tied to the last question actually, it's meant to be 8 weeks from the point that we submit to the point that you get a decision. There are delays in planning across the country, and there have been for the last few years. And so we do allow for up to 12 weeks. The reality is sometimes it can be even longer than that. But as
Yeah.
Danielle said, the biggest benefit of doing like the most applications of any individual submitter in the country is that we have more proof points of how long it's taking individual councils than
Yeah.
anyone else. So we know, for example, that Bristol take a year almost to get a decision back to you at the moment. And so we can tell you that specific about your local authority and give you a more accurate start to finish time frame based on the specifics of your local authority if you were to get in touch. Again, something we can kind of pick up in an advice call with our consultant. So kind of drop us a line on that front too.
Yeah. So Dina has asked, can you talk please about wraparound extensions? How can we do that? We bought a house with already an extension and would like to have a wraparound. That would depend whether the extension that's existing is on the rear or on the side. Kind of the ease of doing that, I would say you definitely can't do a wraparound under permitted development. That's one of the things I spoke about in things to consider when you want to do a PD application. Has it already been extended? Once you connect a side and rear extension together, it forms a wraparound, and that isn't classed as permitted development anymore. So it would have to be householder. It's not impossible. You do just sort of have to meet those guidelines that are set out in the sort of the supplementary planning documents that your council will have, that Joe mentioned at the very start of the presentation. They sort of put out parameters of what they like to see in the borough, what they like to achieve when it comes to householder
Mhm.
applications, depths, heights, things like that. So, if you've got an existing, modest rear extension and you'd like to infill the side, if it's reasonable, and it's acceptable, then it's not impossible to get approved. Obviously we have to be concerned about bulk being added and things like that. So if the site can allow for a wraparound, that's great. Again, each application assessed within its own merit. If you'd like, you can book in for a free advice call and we can take a closer look at the property and sort of establish that feasibility for you.
Definitely, and wraparounds was one of those things actually that these consultations for permit
Yeah.
development were proposing to include, which we were all for because they
Hmm.
can be so useful on a lot of properties, particularly ones that have outriggers or have previous extensions, as Danielle said. And so, getting them under permitted development would have been great for people across kind of the UK to use their permitted development rights more, but we'll see what happens with that. Um, a question here around planning support as part of the kind of Resi process, and whether it's included as standard or it's an additional like price on top of our package. So planning is always included, and the cost for it is set out. We charge £140 for our planning support during your home extension journey. And that kind of allows us to have a team, as Danielle said, the one of the only dedicated planning resources that an architect has, particularly one that has local authority experience. It allows us to provide advice at the very start of your process, as I said, so that you have all of the risks outlined up front, all of the kind of jeopardy that's involved, and that you're not met with any unexpected surprises. So we advise your designer. We help, like we're kind of going through hand in hand with the designer when the extension's being thought of and put into a concept, so that it takes account of planning. And then also that accounts for our time in managing the planning application process, liaising with your planning officer and your council, and also any kind of support you might need after you get that decision through, as I kind of spoke about, in terms of checking your decision notice, making sure that all of your conditions are fulfilled if they're on there, etc., etc. So that's kind of what planning support looks like at Resi.
Yeah. So then we have, would you know if your neighbours made comments? Is it public to view? So this does actually depend on the council whether it's public to view. Um, they have different sort of interfaces on their websites. There's a more common interface that a lot of councils have, but they can change. On the more common one, typically public comments are available to view at sort of different levels. Sometimes they can include the address, sometimes they don't. But regardless of whether the actual comment is available to view in the moment whilst your application is live, either decision that you get, whether that's refused or approved, you do get a delegated report which goes alongside that. That explains all the reasons why they've made that decision on your application. In that, they have to know if there has been any comments received from neighbours, and typically they'll sort of bullet point the issues that are raised within those objections. An objection doesn't mean an automatic refusal. It just means that the council will address the points that were made as part of the comment if they still, under their professional opinion, believe that the application is acceptable. They can still approve it even if there is comments. So you can have a look online. Sometimes they'll say there's been a comment and you can't see it. Because the objections or just comments are then addressed in the report, you are actually also able to just email the case officer and ask them for a copy of the comments made if you'd like. And I'm pretty sure they have to give them over because they're not confidential, I don't believe. No, they're not.
Um, so Laura has asked, if a small side extension has been built without planning, possibly under permitted development, should anything show on the council planning website? Would this cause issues for a future single-story extension for ground floor rear? It's a really good question, actually, because even sometimes when things have been through the planning process, it can be really difficult to dig out old planning permissions, particularly if it predates the 2000s, before there were digital records, widespread, etc. And so if something has been built on your site without planning permission, even if it is permitted development, there is going to be a level of jeopardy because that extension is going to have to be shown on the drawings that you submit for any future application. So there's two things to consider. One, whether it actually is permitted development. If it's not, it may have been there long enough to have passed the time limits for enforcement action. It's something that we can research and dig into, but is quite nuanced. So I'm not going to go into it in detail here. The second thing is, even if it was built at the time considering permitted development, if it wasn't built in accordance with permit development exactly, then it can be a problem. But again, the time limit may have passed for it to be enforced against, and therefore it could be regularized through that subsequent application. Whether it causes an issue for future applications or not kind of depends on the answer to the first question. If it's been there long enough to be regularized, then perfect. If it hasn't and it's not compliant with permitted development limits, or it was done and it's not PD at all, yes, it can cause issues. The kind of two ways it can go are you can either regularize it by including it on future drawings and applying for that at the same time as your future works, or you have to regularize it in and of itself. Or the alternative is, and this is more rare, I would say, a council will enforce against it and ask you to take it down or amend it to comply with rules and limits. That, as I say, is a lot more rare, but it is again quite nuanced. I'm sorry, and so if that is your circumstance, Laura, I'd definitely recommend getting in touch because we can have a dig through those council records, see if there's anything in there, have a look at your site on Google Earth and try and pick out when we think it was built, etc., etc. So yeah, reach out and we can dig into that query a little bit more.
Yeah. So, what is the average cost of applying for an LDC? So, that would depend on the actual application fees itself, or like the entire cost, including design and everything like that. Sort of, we have a quick quote option on our website, or again, you can with us and we can sort of get a more bespoke quote out to you for the actual design. But then the fee for the application itself to the council is a flat rate. It's gone up recently because the government has upped all planning application fees to sort of make that planning system a little bit better for people. And again, you can get in touch and sort of find out what those flat rate fees are across all application types through a call with us.
Definitely. I'm going to whip through some questions very quickly here because we still have 41 left to answer and we've got about 5 minutes left. So apologies if I'm very short and to the point with your question. So starting with Dave. Dave's asked, does Resi handle the building regulation application? Absolutely. We have building regulations designers in-house who will design up the building regs package for you so that it complies. We take on board information from structural engineers who we have partnerships with, who can visit your site, make sure that everything's included on those drawings. So yeah, we kind of handle the process from end to end. We have everyone you need in-house to deliver each package to get you on site. And there's another question here about whether or not we can partner you with builders. Absolutely. We have a network of builders who can take all of those building regulation drawings that are prepared by us, and they can deliver your project on site. We can introduce you to builders, get you a range of tenders so you get a fair reflection of the different specs that your project might want to be delivered at and the associated cost of those. So all of that is a yes. Then we've got a question around if the planning authority rejects your application or makes what you consider to be unreasonable amendments, can that be challenged? The answer to that is yes. So we can submit an appeal to the government. They will put forward, the council will put forward their case, we'll put forward our case, and an independent inspector, they're called, will consider both sides and come to a decision on that. So that's also a yes. Danielle, do you want to take a couple?
Yeah, do you do pre-apps? We do. We would typically advise whether that's probably best for you or not, but if you want to do one regardless, you're more than welcome to. But we absolutely do support in the pre-app process to the council. What factors contribute towards delay of the council? Absolutely, a number of things: staff shortages, volume of applications, funding from the government, many things. What is the time limit for making objections to a planning project? That would be 21 days from either the site notice being put up or the neighbour letter being received by the neighbour. Sometimes objections can go online after that, and it would be at the case officer's discretion to accept those, but typically it's 21 days. Then what do we have? For a PD application, do you need drawings made by an architect or can this be done by a homeowner? They would have to be done by an architect unless you are great at Revit and can do amazing to scale drawings. You need to show the council exactly what you plan on building so that they can say whether it will be permitted development or not. Do we have any experience dealing with ELIN? We absolutely do. We submit quite a lot of applications to ELIN. So yeah, if you live in ELIN, you're more than welcome to come to us and submit.
Someone's asked the same question about Hammersmith and Fulham. Also, yes.
Yes.
Every London borough, we have really good experience with. A number of us also used to work in a number of London
Yeah.
authorities, so we have on the ground experience with those planning departments and those issues. So yeah, if you're in London and you need any kind of planning advice, then honestly, again, I would say this, but we're one of the kind of best resources you can go to in terms of that in-house knowledge. I think we've got a couple of minutes to whip through a few more. If we haven't answered one of your questions, please get in touch, either through contacting us directly, booking in an advice call. There's a lot of really good questions coming through and we just don't have time to get through to them all. But yeah, if you book in an advice call, you can get kind of advice on the phone for free about your project, and that's the best place to kind of follow up with some of these questions. We'll
Yeah.
take a couple more.
For a garden room, if someone was to sleep there, even if not for a regular basis, is planning permission required? Again, it would depend on the sort of size, the internal layout, whether it could be PD or a householder planning permission. If the structure itself is fine and things like that, then typically it is okay. The council just may apply some conditions to it to restrict any sort of renting out of that room. What else do we have? Is a two-story extension almost an outright no on a terrace? Again, that would depend on your situation. Other properties along the road may have already extended. It would depend on your council's guidance, sort of the limitations that they put out onto what they like to see for two-story rear extensions. So you can just come and ask us. We'll take a look at the property and give you a feasibility.
For sure. I'm going to take one last question, which is, if you're buying a house and it's already got planning permission in place, as well as a certificate of permitted development, but you want to amend those plans, are there kind of any pitfalls you need to be careful of? There are, because you need to make sure that those plans and those that certificate of PD are still in date. So during the presentation, I said that they last for a period of 3 years until the works have been started, and so you need to make sure that that they're within that time limit, so that they set that precedent. But the other thing is, when you're amending those plans, it's essentially going back through the process from scratch. It's, as Danielle said, each application is assessed on its own merits. So the proposals, as you put them forward, will be assessed by a planning officer completely fresh. It's also likely to potentially be a different planning officer. The other thing to consider is, depending on how long ago that was, your council might have new policies, they might have new guidance. And so, because there's a permission in place, it's not kind of slam dunk. It doesn't mean that you can just crack on and amend those plans and it's going to be, super easy. You need to kind of be aware of those things. And the kind of subsequent question to that is, can we help even when they already have drawings? For sure. We can recreate those drawings in our software and amend the proposals. So we can take what you've already got, just copy them in, and then draw up new concepts on top of those to submit to the council. Thank you, everyone, for an overwhelming number of questions, to be honest. As I say, it's always a real joy to do these sessions, because everyone is super engaged about planning. I think because most people don't know much about it and it is super confusing. But if you have any kind of follow-ups, if you want to get in touch, as I say, booking in for an advice call through the website is the easiest thing to do. Our consultants are super clued up and are able to take you through the specifics of your project. And as I say, the recording will be on YouTube for you to watch back as well if you love planning that much. So from Danielle and I, thank you for attending. It's been really great, and yeah, look forward to hearing from a number of you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.